The man in the back seat could feel the eyes on him, the weight of the crowd's stares making the air feel even heavier. He didn't let it bother him, but it was impossible to ignore the way everyone was watching him like he was somehow the center of attention. It felt strange. He was just a man walking down the street. He hadn't done anything wrong. One of the backup officers leaned over to the officer who had made the stop. "Do you need us to search him?" The question was casual, but the tone suggested that the officer was ready to escalate things. The backup officer didn't even glance at the man in the car, and it felt as though he was just going through the motions, like they were expected to handle things the same way they always did. The officer who had made the stop shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his voice clipped. He was still pacing. His nerves were starting to show. "Let's see if we can get anything on him first." The first officer had his phone out now, tapping away at the screen. His eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the device trying to find something to confirm his suspicion, but there was nothing. No criminal record. No open warrants. No reason to be suspicious at all. Frustration began to mount inside the officer. His hands shook slightly as he typed in the man's name and description again. Still nothing. The more he searched, the more his mind seemed to race, trying to piece together why this man was so calm. Why wasn't he reacting like everyone else? Why wasn't he scared? The officer's frustration was obvious now, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't going to back down. There had to be something. There had to be a reason this man was so detached. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and that was something he couldn't allow. He needed answers. The backup officers stood nearby, not sure what to do. They exchanged glances but said nothing. They had been called in because the officer had asked for help, but they didn't want to step in unless absolutely necessary. It was clear that this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was turning into something else. Something bigger, though no one could quite put their finger on what. The man in the back seat of the squad car remained as still as ever. His face was hard to read, but inside he was starting to feel a sense of unease. He wasn't sure how long this would go on. He wasn't sure if the officer would just let him go or if things would escalate further. The officer hadn't given him any reason for his actions. He hadn't explained why he was being detained, just that he was. The minutes dragged on, but the officer's tension only seemed to increase. The man's phone buzzed once in his pocket, but he didn't move. He knew what it meant. He knew that the message was important. He had an appointment he couldn't afford to miss. But he also knew that he couldn't focus on that right now. This situation was taking all of his attention. The backup officers were starting to feel uncomfortable now, as if they were caught between two worlds. They weren't sure whether to support the first officer or speak up. They were unsure about how far things could go. If they sided with the officer, would they be complicit in something wrong? If they stepped in, would they get in trouble with their own department? The officer who had made the stop, meanwhile, was still scrolling through his phone. His face was hard to read, but it was clear that something wasn't adding up. There were too many unanswered questions, and his gut told him that the man wasn't being honest. But nothing on his phone confirmed his suspicions. Finally, he let out a frustrated sigh and slammed his phone down onto the dashboard. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew deep down that he had no real reason to hold the man any longer. But then he had an idea. "I'm going to call it in," the officer said, looking up at his backup. His voice was no longer as sure of himself as it had been earlier. "Let's see if we can get someone to confirm his identity." He dialed a number and the phone rang for a moment before someone on the other end picked up. The officer barely gave his name before launching into a string of questions, asking for any relevant information about the man sitting in the back of the squad car. He still didn't fully believe that the man was innocent, but he had run out of options. The backup officers exchanged uncertain looks, but they said nothing. They stood waiting, and then the unexpected happened. The officer's face changed as he listened to the voice on the other end of the phone. His eyes widened, and for a moment he stopped pacing. He stood still. "Wait, what did you just say?" the officer asked, his voice almost cracking. He listened for a moment longer, his hand gripping the phone tighter as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, with a final look at the man in the back of the squad car, he hung up. His jaw tightened and the weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. The backup officers stepped forward, sensing that something had shifted. What had happened? What had changed? The officer who had made the stop didn't say anything at first. He was too stunned, his thoughts racing, processing the information he had just received. He turned to the backup officers slowly. Let him go. The tension was thick in the air, and for a few moments everything felt frozen. The backup officers, who had been standing in the background waiting for some kind of instruction, exchanged glances. They didn't know what had just happened, but they could tell that something had shifted. The officer who had made the stop, who had been so certain and so aggressive just minutes ago, was now standing still, his phone still in his hand. His face had gone pale, and his posture had changed from the earlier aggressiveness to something more uncertain. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened was now pressing down on him. He stood there, his mind still processing the words he'd just heard on the phone. The voice on the other end had confirmed it. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't some random civilian walking down the street. The man in the back of the squad car was someone entirely different, someone with a much bigger role than any of them could have imagined. The officer's fingers tightened around the phone, and he slowly turned to face the man in the back seat, who was still sitting quietly, his expression unreadable. It was as though the world had shifted, and the officer was only now realizing that he had made a mistake. A big one. Let him go, the officer said, his voice low, almost like he didn't believe what he was saying. He repeated it louder this time, as if forcing himself to accept the words. Let him go. The backup officers stood motionless for a moment, not understanding why the sudden shift had happened. They'd seen how tense things were just a few minutes ago. They'd seen the officer demand answers, grow frustrated, and even get angry. They had been ready to back him up, ready to follow his lead. But now it was like they were standing on completely different ground. One of the backup officers took a cautious step forward. What's going on? He asked, his voice hesitant. He wasn't sure whether to be confused, concerned, or simply shocked. The first officer didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his eyes still glued to the ground, trying to make sense of what had just been revealed. He had been sure of everything. He'd been certain that this man was hiding something, that he had to be guilty of something. But now everything was being turned upside down. He had been wrong. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It's him. He's not just some guy off the street. He's FBI. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and for a moment the backup officers didn't know how to react. The idea that this man, this quiet, calm man, was with the FBI was almost impossible to believe. They had all assumed he was just a regular person, caught up in some small-town stop for no reason at all. But now the story had changed completely. You're sure? One of the backup officers asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The FBI? The officer nodded, his hands still shaking slightly as he spoke. Yeah, that's what I was just told. The man in the back of the car is FBI. He's an agent. I don't know the details, but that's what they said. The news hit like a shockwave, and the backup officers seemed unsure of how to respond. The whole situation had taken a turn that none of them could have predicted. How had they ended up here? How had they been so sure of something so wrong? For a few moments no one spoke. The air was filled with the sound of distant traffic and the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, but the words that had just been exchanged between the officer and the person on the other end of the phone were still echoing in everyone's minds. The man in the back of the squad car wasn't just any civilian. He wasn't just someone they could dismiss or treat harshly because of a gut feeling. He was part of something much bigger. A small-town stop had just turned into a major operation, and no one knew what to do next. The officer who had originally stopped the man stood there, his thoughts racing. He had made a mistake. A big one. He had judged this man based on assumptions, based on the color of his skin and the way he looked. He had been so sure, so convinced that this was just another case of someone trying to hide something. But now the truth was crashing down on him, and it was hard to accept. The weight of his own actions hit him like a freight train. The man in the back seat of the squad car didn't speak. He hadn't said much at all throughout this whole ordeal. But now, as the truth came to light, he kept his silence. His expression was still calm, but his eyes were alert, watching the officers, waiting for what would happen next. He hadn't fought back or argued. He had remained composed throughout the entire situation, but inside he was dealing with a mix of frustration and anxiety. He had an important mission, an important task to complete, and this encounter was only slowing him down. Finally, one of the backup officers stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "What now?" he asked, looking at the officer who had made the stop. Do we just let him go? The officer who had initially stopped the man exhaled slowly. His mind was still processing the information. It felt like everything he had known, everything he had believed about the situation had been flipped upside down, but there was no denying it now. He had been wrong. His assumptions had been off and the truth was right in front of him. Yeah, he muttered. We let him go. He turned toward the squad car and with one final look at the man sitting inside, nodded. The backup officers stepped aside, giving the man room to leave. The man in the back seat didn't hesitate. He opened the door, stepped out, and looked at the officers one last time. His calm demeanor had not changed. He hadn't raised his voice or argued, even when they had unfairly detained him. He simply took the moment for what it was. The officer who had made the stop didn't look at the man directly, but he couldn't help but notice the way the man moved, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. It was as if he had already known that this moment would come, that there would be a reckoning. And now it was over. The man didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He had already made it clear that he was no threat. He was just trying to go about his day, and now finally he was free to continue. He turned and walked away from the squad car, disappearing down the street with the same calm stride he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. The backup officers watched him go, still processing what had just happened. They knew they had been part of something bigger than they realized. They had just witnessed a moment where assumptions were shattered and biases were exposed. But they didn't know what to say, what to think. All they knew was that they had just been part of something that didn't fit into the neat little boxes they had been taught to expect. The officer who had stopped the man stood there for a long time, his hands on his hips. He didn't know if he felt guilty, angry, or just confused. Maybe all of those things. He wasn't sure. But he knew that this encounter had changed him in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't realized it before, but this wasn't just about a man being detained. It was about something deeper, something bigger, and now he had to live with the knowledge that he had been wrong, that he had made a mistake that could have had far more serious consequences than anyone had ever anticipated. For the man, though, the encounter was over. He had played his role, kept his cool, and now he was on his way. The bigger picture was still waiting for him, and whatever had just happened wouldn't stop him from completing his mission. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but reflect on how strange it was to be judged and mistaken for something he wasn't, something that had nothing to do with him at all. News travels fast, especially in a small town. By the next day, the entire community was talking about the man who had been wrongly detained by police, only to turn out to be an undercover FBI agent. It had started as a quiet afternoon, just another traffic stop, nothing unusual. But now it was everywhere. People were sharing videos on social media, discussing it in barbershops, stores, and even at the dinner table. Nobody knew the full story yet, but they knew enough to talk. A black man walking down the street stopped without reason, held for nearly an hour, and then suddenly released when officers found out who he really was. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in the country, but it hit differently when it happened in your own neighborhood. For the officer who made the stop, things didn't feel the same anymore. He went home that evening and sat quietly in his living room, not even turning on the TV. His thoughts kept replaying the moment he had placed the man in the back of his squad car. The man hadn't resisted, hadn't shouted or cursed. He had stayed calm the entire time, and that made it even harder to deal with now. The officer had made assumptions, not based on behavior, not based on any real reason, just a feeling. And that feeling had almost caused a disaster. What if the man had reacted? What if things had gone in a different direction? It didn't happen, but it could have. The department had already started asking questions. His supervisor had called him in that morning and asked for a full report. What was the reason for the stop? Why was backup called? How long was the man held? The officer had tried to explain. He thought something was suspicious. But the more he talked, the more hollow his words sounded. Even he knew it wasn't a good enough reason. Meanwhile, the video recorded by a bystander had already reached thousands online. It showed the officer questioning the man aggressively. There was no violence, but the tone, the attitude, it said enough. People didn't need to see physical harm to know when someone was being treated unfairly. The comment section was full of frustration. Some wrote things like, "This keeps happening. When will it stop?" Others simply said, He handled that with so much calm, respect. The man himself, the FBI agent, had already returned to his assignment. He was used to being unnoticed, moving quietly, blending in, but after this incident, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it. He hadn't told many people about it, not his colleagues, not even his closest friends. There was no need. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been treated like a suspect. He sat in a quiet cafe later that week, sipping coffee and watching the street outside. Life was moving on like nothing had happened, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't angry, and not exactly. He had faced worse during his career, but this felt personal. Not because he was an FBI agent, but because he was a human being who had been judged unfairly. He thought about the officer who stopped him. He remembered the look in his eyes. Not hatred, but something else. Fear, control, maybe even insecurity. And that made him wonder, how many other people had been stopped by the same officer? How many had no badge to protect them, no powerful agency to call in and confirm their identity? It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the system. A system where someone's skin color still triggered suspicion. A system where people could be doing absolutely nothing wrong and still find themselves questioned, searched and detained. A few days later, the man was asked to attend a private meeting with local law enforcement officials, not as part of his FBI duties, but as someone who had experienced injustice, someone whose story had caught the public's attention. The meeting room was small. Around the table sat a few senior officers, a community liaison, and the man himself. No cameras, no reporters, just a quiet space to talk. One of the senior officers cleared his throat and began. "We just want to say, we're aware of what happened, and it's being looked into," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. The man nodded slowly. "I'm not here for an apology," he replied. "I'm here because this isn't about me. It's about what could have happened, and what still might happen to others." No one interrupted. He continued. "There are people in this town who get stopped just because of how they look. They don't have a badge to protect them. They don't work for federal agencies. They're just trying to live their lives. What happened to me, thought it's not the first time. But it can't keep happening." The room was silent for a moment. One officer, older and seemingly more experienced, spoke up. "I've been doing this job for over 20 years, he said. "And I'll admit we don't always get it right. But things are changing, slowly." The man looked him in the eyes. "Change doesn't come from silence," he said. "It comes from people admitting when something is broken and choosing to fix it." It wasn't a dramatic conversation. No one yelled, no one stormed out. But something important happened that day. Honest words were spoken and people listened. Whether anything would truly change, no one could say yet. But it was a start. Outside that room, the community was still reacting. Some felt proud that the truth came out without violence. Others were angry, saying it shouldn't take someone being FBI to be treated fairly. And they were right. At a local community center, people gathered for a forum about policing and fairness. The man didn't attend, but his story was mentioned more than once. People talked about accountability, about training, about respect. Parents stood up and said they were tired of warning their kids about how to stay safe during a police stop. Young men talked about their fear of walking alone at night. The emotions in the room were real, raw, and powerful. Back at the police department, the officer who made the stop was still under internal review. No one knew what would happen next, whether he'd be suspended, reassigned, or just sent for additional training. But something inside him had already started to change. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't post anything online, but he did spend a lot of time thinking. He started reading articles he'd normally ignore. He watched videos of others who had gone through similar situations. Slowly, he began to realize that what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a larger problem. One he had contributed to. He wasn't a bad person, but he had made a bad decision. And now it was up to him to learn from it. Meanwhile, the FBI agent continued his work quietly. He didn't want fame or attention. He just wanted fairness, and for everyone. He knew this incident would follow him for a while. Not because of what he did, but because of how it reflected the world we live in. Still, he walked with his head high. Not because of pride, but because of purpose. A few weeks had passed since the incident, but it still felt fresh in many people's minds. It wasn't just another story that faded away with time. Something about it had left a mark on the community, a kind of quiet wake-up call. People who had never spoken about race, police stops, or justice were now having those conversations. Not loudly, not with anger, but with real thought. For the FBI agent, life had mostly returned to normal. He was back to doing his job, traveling, meeting people, working on investigations. But every time he walked down a quiet street, he remembered that afternoon. Not because he was scared, and not because he was angry, but because it reminded him how easily someone can be misunderstood just because of the way they look. He didn't hold hate in his heart. He had seen enough in his career to know that people made mistakes. But this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about how those mistakes happen over and over to people who don't have anyone to call, who don't wear a badge, and who don't have any proof of who they are except their own word. One evening, as he sat alone in a quiet diner on the edge of town, a man walked in and paused near his table. It was the same police officer who had stopped him that day. The agent looked up, calm and composed. He didn't show any surprise, but he knew something was different this time. The officer didn't wear his uniform today. He had come in quietly without the authority or power he usually carried on the streets. His face was serious but not hard. He looked nervous, like he had something to say but didn't quite know how to begin. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" the officer asked, his voice quieter than usual. The agent nodded once, motioning to the chair across from him. There was a pause. Just the quiet hum of the diner's kitchen in the background and the soft clinking of cutlery on nearby tables. The officer took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I didn't come here to defend myself," he said slowly. "I know I got it wrong that day, and I've been thinking about it every day since." The agent didn't interrupt. He just listened. His calm presence made the officer continue. "I don't know why I did what I did. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was pressure. Or maybe it was something I need to unlearn. But the truth is, I judged you before I even spoke to you, and that's on me." The words hung in the air for a moment. Honest, heavy, and real. The agent finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "You're not the first," he said, "and sadly you won't be the last. But the fact that you came here, that you said that out loud, it means something." The officer looked relieved but still uncomfortable. "I know it's not enough. Saying sorry doesn't fix the bigger problem, but I needed to say it to you. Not just to make peace, but to remind myself that I need to do better." The agent nodded again. "Then start with your own choices," he replied. "You wear the uniform. People trust you, or at least they want to. You have more power than most, so how you use that power matters, not just in big moments, but in small ones too." There was another quiet moment. Then the officer stood up. "Thank you for not treating me the way I treated you," he said softly. With that, he turned and walked out. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect a second chance. He just left with the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could learn something from what had happened. The agent sat for a while longer, sipping his coffee and watching the world outside the diner window. People passed by, and some rushing, some laughing, some deep in their own thoughts. He wondered how many of them had ever been judged unfairly. How many had carried the weight of being misunderstood? In the following weeks, the town began to see small changes. The local police department quietly introduced new community training programs. Not because they were forced to, but because they knew they needed it. Officers were encouraged to attend workshops about bias, empathy, and human behavior. These weren't just rules on paper, they were conversations. Honest ones, community leaders, pastors, teachers, and even students got involved. People were starting to ask better questions. Not just what went wrong, but how can we do better? And the agent, though his face wasn't in the spotlight, had sparked something without even trying. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't called for revenge or punishment. He had simply stood in his truth, calm, firm, and respectful. That had been more powerful than anything else. One day, he visited a local school to speak to a small group of students, not as an agent, but as someone who had been through something difficult and had chosen to stay grounded. He didn't tell them every detail. He didn't need to. He just shared one important message. Never let someone else's fear define who you are, he told them, but also never stop believing that people can change, even the ones who get it wrong. A young boy in the back raised his hand and asked, "How did you stay so calm when they treated you like that?" The agent smiled slightly and replied, "Because I knew who I was, and nothing they said or did could take that away. That moment stayed with the students long after the talk ended. It wasn't about being strong in the loudest way. It was about being strong in the quietest moments, when no one is watching and you still choose what's right. As time passed, the story slowly faded from the headlines. Other news took over, as it always does. But for the people in that town, and especially for the ones who had seen it unfold up close, it had changed something. It had shown that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made through anger or noise, but through calm truth and quiet strength, and for the agent it was just another chapter in his life. He didn't look back with regret or bitterness. He moved forward with clarity, knowing that even one quiet act of dignity could plant seeds of change in places where it was needed most.